The Threshold Assembly, a coalition of 9 spacefaring civilizations that had carved up known space between them for the last 11,000 years, discovered Earth the way they discovered every other pre-warp civilization, by accident, while mapping gravitational anomalies along the outer spiral arm. A scout vessel belonging to the Osaic Dominion, a reptilian trade species with an economy built entirely on the harvesting and reselling of habitable worlds, drifted into the Sol system with its sensors idle and its crew half asleep. What they found was a blue planet, teeming with a bipedal species that had only just begun broadcasting radio signals into the void. Songs, sports commentary, political speeches, cries for help from wars they were fighting against each other for reasons that made no sense to anyone who wasn't human. The Osaic captain, a broad-snouted creature named Vizrak, logged the following assessment into the assembly database. Subject species, bipedal, hairless, weapons technology approximately 4,000 years behind assembly standard. No shields. No FTL. No coordinated planetary defense. Estimated threat level negligible. Recommend classification as Tier 7 Harvest World. Livestock or labor candidate pending further study. It was not an insult. It was, in the Assembly's eyes, simply an observation. Humanity had not yet cracked fusion reliably. It had not yet unified its own planet under a single government. It fought itself more than it had ever fought anything else. To eyes that had watched empires rise and fall across 100,000 years, humans looked like children playing with sticks in a sandbox, utterly unaware that a wolf was already watching them through the fence. The Assembly's 9th Council convened 11 months later. The vote was not close. 7 species in favor of harvest, 1 abstention, 1 dissent. The dissenting vote came from the Ilkarish, an insectal species who had, 5,000 years earlier, been on the receiving end of an assembly harvest themselves before earning their seat at the table through sheer attrition and cunning. Their representative, a diplomat known only by the designation Thesk Van, said something that would later be quoted in every human history book ever written about the war. You have not asked what happens to a species that spent its entire history fighting itself. You have not asked what such a species becomes when it finally has something else to fight. No one listened. The vote passed. As single Osaic harvest fleet, 6 vessels, minor by assembly standards, more than enough for a Tier 7 world with no orbital defenses, was dispatched to Sol. They expected livestock. They found something else entirely. Commander Elena Reyes had been a fighter pilot for the United States Navy for 11 years before the sky over the Pacific tore open, and something that was not a plane, not a satellite, and not anything humanity had a name for, drifted down through the clouds like it owned the air. She was 34,000 feet over open water on a routine patrol when her radar lit up with a contact the size of a small city. No transponder, no flight plan, no radio chatter. Just 6 enormous angular shapes, arranged in a formation too precise to be anything but deliberate, descending toward the surface of the Pacific Ocean like they were lowering themselves onto a dinner table. "Command, this is Falcon 2-1, she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "I have visual on 6 unidentified aerial contacts. Altitude approximately 4,000 feet, descending. These are not aircraft. I say again, these are not aircraft." The response took 11 seconds to arrive. In a war that would eventually be measured in years, those 11 seconds would be remembered as the last moment humanity did not know it was already in a fight. Falcon 2-1. Maintain visual. Do not engage. Repeat. Do not engage. Reyes maintained visual for exactly 40 more seconds. Then one of the 6 ships opened fire on a Taiwanese fishing trawler that had wandered too close, vaporizing it and its crew of 11 in a flash of white light that Reyes would see behind her eyelids for the rest of her life. She engaged anyway. The Osaic Harvest Fleet had not anticipated resistance, because resistance had never mattered before. Tier 7 worlds didn't have weapons capable of scratching assembly hull plating. The math had always worked. Point defense systems weren't even brought fully online because bringing them online cost fuel, and fuel cost money. And the Osaic Dominion did not spend money. It didn't have to. Reyes put 2 AIM-120 missiles into the flank of the nearest vessel. Neither missile did meaningful damage to the hull, but the detonation, close range, kinetic, utterly unlike anything in the assembly's threat models for a Tier 7 species, knocked out an external sensor array and, more importantly, knocked out the ship's translator relay, which meant that for the next 6 minutes, the Osaic Harvest Fleet had no idea what the small, screaming aircraft harassing them was saying over open radio. What it was saying was every human military frequency on Earth screaming the same 5 words in a dozen languages. We are under attack. By the time the sun set over the Pacific that day, every nuclear power on the planet had scrambled its air defenses. China, Russia, the United States, the UK, France, India, nations that had spent decades pointing warheads at each other suddenly found themselves staring at the same radar returns, hearing the same panicked reports, watching the same 6 ships hover over the ocean, like gods deciding whether the ants below were worth stepping on. For the first time in recorded history, every human government on the planet opened a shared communications channel within the same hour. They did not do it out of unity. They did it out of fear. But fear, it turned out, was a language the whole species spoke fluently. Captain Vaisrock did not consider the situation urgent until the 4th missile strike. The first 3 had been, in his own private assessment, a statistical curiosity, a Tier 7 species with primitive kinetic weaponry managing, against all odds, to land hits on assembly hull plating. Unpleasant. Embarrassing even, given that a full report would need to be filed with the 9th Council. But not urgent. The 4th strike came from something the assembly's sensors had genuinely never catalogued before, a submarine-launched ballistic missile, reaching the surface of the Pacific at a velocity and trajectory that no threat model for Sol had accounted for, because no one on the Osaic ship had bothered to ask whether the ocean itself might be armed. It struck the underside of the flagship. The hull held, but the impact sensors screamed through the bridge in a language of alarm that every species in the assembly understood instinctively, and Vaisrock understood in that moment that something about the initial assessment of this planet had been catastrophically wrong. "Pull the fleet back to high orbit," he ordered. "Full defensive posture. I want an updated threat assessment before we—" "Captain." His sensor officer's voice cracked with something Vaisrock had not heard from a subordinate in decades. "Fear. Captain, there are more of them. Hundreds more. All of them are firing." Vaisrock looked at the tactical display and, for the first time since he had taken command of a harvest fleet, felt his hands begin to shake. Every nation on Earth that possessed an air force had scrambled it. Every nation that possessed a navy had surfaced it. Every silo, every submarine, every runway on the planet had come alive within the same 90-minute window, because the species below them, a species the Assembly had assessed as fractured beyond the possibility of unity, had, in the space of a single afternoon, done something no Assembly diplomat, historian, or war planner had ever seen a Tier 7 civilization do. They had stopped fighting each other, and they had started fighting the sky. The Osaic fleet retreated to high orbit within the hour, badly shaken but largely intact. 6 ships against an entire planet's military was, by any rational calculus, still an overwhelming advantage. Vezrak's hull had held. His weapons were untouched. On paper, nothing about the tactical situation had actually changed. But Vezrak had not survived 4 decades in Assembly service by trusting paper. He watched from orbit as the humans below did something else no threat model had prepared him for. They did not celebrate. They did not stand down. Instead, factories that had been building cars an hour earlier began retooling. Radio broadcasts that had been playing music began broadcasting technical schematics openly in the clear. On every frequency they had a level of transparency that made no tactical sense to an Assembly mind raised on secrecy and hierarchy, until Vezrak realized what he was actually looking at. They weren't hiding what they were building. They wanted every human on the planet to be able to build it, too. Species Assessment Update, Vezrak said into his log, his voice quieter than it had been in years. Recommend immediate revision of tier classification. This species does not fight like a Tier 7 civilization. It does not organize like one. It does not think like one. He paused. Recommend full Assembly Council review before any further action is taken against Sol. He sent the report. It would take 9 days to reach the 9th Council, given the distances involved. He did not know it yet, but he would not live to hear their response. On the 6th day, a human voice reached the Osaic flagship, not through any channel the Assembly had established, but through a jury-rigged transmitter built from parts scavenged out of a downed Assembly reconnaissance drone that had crashed in the Nevada desert 3 days prior. Human engineers had reverse-engineered enough of its translation matrix in 72 hours to construct a crude working relay. 72 hours. A process the Assembly's own engineering corps typically budgeted 11 months for. When reverse engineering a rival species' hardware, the voice that came through was not a general's. It was not a president's. It belonged to a woman named Dr. Amara Osei, a linguist who had spent the last 3 days awake, translating between 6 languages and a species that had no name for the concept of surrender, because it had never needed one before. Her message was short. "This is Earth," she said. "We don't know who you are. We don't know why you came. But you should know this. We have spent our entire history fighting each other over borders that don't exist past the edge of our own atmosphere. We have never had a reason to stop until today. You gave us one." A pause. Somewhere in that pause, Vezrak realized the entire species behind that voice had made a decision. "We are not asking you to leave," Osei said. "We are telling you what happens if you don't." The transmission ended. Vezrak sat in the silence of his bridge for a long time afterward, staring at a tactical display that told him his fleet was still, by every objective measure, more powerful than anything on the surface of that planet. And yet, for the first time in his life, he gave an order he had never given before. "Signal the council," he said. "Tell them we need reinforcements. Tell them Sol was misclassified." He looked out at the blue planet turning beneath him and added one more line to the report, a line that would later be recovered from the flagship's black box and would become, in human history, one of the most quoted lines of the entire war. "They were never weak. We simply never gave them a reason to be strong. Now we have, and I do not think we can undo it." 9 days later, the 9th Council of the Threshold Assembly reconvened in emergency session, summoned by a report that had thrown their entire military doctrine into question. Species that had gone to war 100 times against 100 different civilizations sat in stunned silence as Vazrak's log was read aloud, a log that ended not with a victory report, but with a request for immediate reinforcement against a planet the Assembly had, 11 months earlier, dismissed as livestock. Theskvan, the Ilkarish diplomat who had cast a lone dissenting vote, did not say "I told you so." She didn't need to. Instead, she asked a single question that silenced the chamber. "What does a species become?" she said quietly, "when it stops fighting itself?" No one in that room had an answer, but far below them, on a small blue planet at the edge of the spiral arm, humanity was already building the answer in shipyards, in laboratories, in the retooled factories of a species that had just discovered, for the first time in its entire history, what it looked like when it stopped aiming at itself. The Assembly had come expecting livestock. What they had found, what they were only now beginning to understand, was a species that had spent its entire existence training for war without ever realizing it, and had simply been waiting all along for something worth fighting. They had it now, and the galaxy was about to learn exactly what that meant. If this is the first time you're hearing what happened in the skies over the Pacific that day, you should know this was only the beginning. The Assaic fleet retreated, but retreat was never the same as victory. What comes next didn't happen in the sky. It happened on the ground when humanity stopped asking whether the Assembly would come back and started preparing for the day they did. Next time on The Rise of Earth, Episode 2, The Day Earth Fought Back, you won't believe what humanity built in the 6 months the Assembly gave them to prepare. And you really won't believe what was waiting for the next fleet that came looking for livestock. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, the best thing you can do is hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss Episode 2 when it drops. And if you want early access to it right now, along with the rest of the Humanity Chronicles, the join link is below. Until next time, this has been Nova Archives. Stay curious, stay human.